The Vikings were ocean-going pirates, known mainly from their medieval accounts of their victims in Britain, Ireland and France, where gangs of heathen raiders pillaged Christian towns from the 8th to the 11th centuries. But we also know a lot about their myths and religious beliefs, thanks to the poems and stories preserved in medieval Icelandic manuscripts. But another and somewhat less well-known source which sheds so much light on the spiritual life of the Norse pagan peoples is to be found in the landscape itself. Sweden in particular is covered in ancient ritual sites which were used by the Vikings and their ancestors. Some of them date to the medieval Viking era, while others are much older, yet were still in use during Viking times. In this film, I travel around Sweden to show you some of the most fascinating and mysterious archaeological religious sites, and through them help you to understand a bit more about the ancient religion of the Norse peoples and where you can go in Sweden to see it for yourself. Almost nothing remains of Viking architecture, except some churches in Norway. We can reconstruct what their houses looked like, and you can view some such buildings in places like Birka Island in Sweden. We know from written sources that a great gilded temple once stood here by the burial mounds of Gamla Uppsala, but there is nothing left of it today. Yet, modern pagans continue to conduct their pagan rites here. The remains of a temple were discovered at Treudd in Denmark, in which wooden poles with faces representing the gods would have stood. We also know that a lot of Norse religion took place outdoors in sacred areas such as burial grounds, which survive to this day and which you can easily visit. The Norse are known for the use of ships in their burial traditions. I made a whole series about ship burials of the ancient Nordic boat cult, and will be touching on the subject again now. Not all the diverse Norse burial types involved boats or ships, but they certainly involved elaborate rituals and cultic dramas which referred to mythical motifs in which the dead travelled to the next world, either on horseback, in a horse-drawn vehicle, or in a boat. The dead were led by a psychopomp figure, perhaps a Valkyrie or a god, and archaeology indicates that these were often represented by dogs who were, like the horses, included in the ritual and sacrificed and buried with the deceased as part of the funeral. In one of the boat graves from Uppsala, dated to the 9th century AD, a rich and well-dressed woman was buried together with two animals, a hen and a dog. The dog was placed outside the stern at the end of the ride, as though it would guide the boat. Dogs are found in a similar context in pre-Viking era boat burials in the mounds at Vendel too. This mediating function of dogs between the world of the living and of the dead is well documented, even in the early Bronze Age Indo-European burials from Russia, as well as in mythological examples such as the ancient Greek hound of Hades, Kerberos, or Garma, the Old Norse guard dog of Hell's Gate, or indeed the four-eyed dogs referred to in ancient Iranian and Indian texts which await the souls of the dead. The elaborate funeral rites could last for days and often included the erection of a grave mound, also known as a barrow, which remained a cultic site after the ritual was complete, because barrows were seen as a liminal space, like a threshold between this world and the next. This is why Old Norse poets, skalds, referred to barrows and related monuments with kennings such as Dáðhraðr, doors of the dead. The barrow continued to be a place in which people could communicate with their dead relatives. For example, in the poem Hörvarakvíða in the saga Hervera saga och Hedrix. Hervor summons her dead father, Heidreke, from his grave in a ritual during which it is said, Knigen helglind, hauger opnust. The gate of the world of death is lowered. Barrows open. And then Hervor finds herself heima imilum, between the worlds. In the Eddic poem Gruagaldr, Svipdag performs a necromantic rite to raise his mother, Grua, from her barrow, so she can in turn sing 9 magic Galdr songs to protect him in a coming journey. This sort of thing continued for long after Christianization. I previously uploaded a lecture on the subject of sacred landscape and enduring belief in the power of barrows in Britain, but similar beliefs persisted in Sweden too. As recently as the 18th century, legal proceedings reveal that an old woman from the island of Gotland is said to have cured diseases by reciting a magical charm, which began
Syster går till graven och väcker upp käre brodern sin.
Even the pagan gods themselves mirrored such practices in the mythology. In the Eddic poem Balderstraumur, Odin speaks from the land of the living to a vulva or witch in the world of the dead. It is through the same kind of ritual communication with a dead witch that Odin acquires esoteric knowledge in another poem, Völuspor. What the Norse called hauger and Swedes call höger are variously termed barrows, tumuli, or cairns in English. These are prehistoric grave mounds which are found in many Indo-European cultures, including the medieval Germanic culture of the Norse. Their tradition of burying the noble dead in large round mounds of earth or rocks derives from a prehistoric tradition from Eastern Europe's so-called Kurgan culture, which is the source of Indo-European languages and cultures across Eurasia. Barrows were built near the Dniester estuary in southwest Ukraine from 4000 BC, and they spread to Danubian Europe by 3500 BC, and all the way to Denmark by 2800 BC, in the form of the single grave culture, which developed into the Bellbygger culture of northern Europe, whose round barrows are to be found all around Stonehenge. The earliest Indo-Europeans in Scandinavia proper were associated with the battle axe culture, but they didn't actually bury their dead in barrows. The tradition of barrows spread from Denmark to Scandinavia during the Nordic Bronze Age, when great kings were buried in enormous mounds, like this one at Håga, in which numerous valuable gold items were discovered. These barrows continued to play an important role in Norse pagan beliefs, not only in the 2,800 years between the start of the Nordic Bronze Age and the Christianization of Viking Scandinavia, but even into recent times, as already mentioned. But the original pagan rites associated with their construction have only been rediscovered through archaeology. Looking at Iron Age barrows from Sweden, it is clear that the first thing they did was to burn and purify the ground with fire, clearing brush in the process. Then they marked off the sacred area, usually with a circle of stones, which could be made by driving a post into the ground and marking a perfect circle around it with the aid of a cord tied to the post. Archaeology shows that the posts sometimes remained in place throughout the ritual building of the barrow, and this makes sense when you consider the massive importance of posts as a cosmic center in the Norse religion. The famous historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, wrote about such rites in association with his theory of the cosmic center. Religious peoples like to live close to their gods, and so they are joined to the sacred world through a physical reference point, a cosmic center or world axis uniting the divine and the earthly. Among Germanic peoples, this took the form of a tree or pillar. An 8th century manuscript describes how Saint Boniface recently cut down an oak tree sacred to Thor, whom the Saxons called Donar, while other sources describe how Charlemagne destroyed a great pillar called Irminsul, which was worshipped by the Saxons. The monk Rudolf from the monastery of Fulda wrote that they regarded it as a cosmic pillar as it supported the universe. This description resembles that of the great ash tree of the world called Yggdrasill, Larathr and Mimameithr, where it is described in the Norse mythology of medieval Icelandic literature. Odin, the highest of the gods, performed a self-sacrifice on this sacred tree, which was likely represented with actual physical trees and pillars used in the rituals of Norse peoples. Rituals that in all probability mirrored the ritual sacrifice Odin himself performed when he hung from that tree, which is variously referred to in terms invoking both a gallows and a horse. Adam of Bremen wrote in the 11th century that the Norse hung many animals in sacrifice from trees adjacent to the great barrows and pagan temple at Gamla Uppsala. Similarly, the 10th century account of Vikings on the Volga by the Arab emissary Ibn Fadlan described the suspended parts of sacrificed animals on upraised posts, and that some of these posts had the faces of the gods carved onto them. We can see evidence of the sacrificial tree in archaeology too. The best example was found beneath the church at Rösaring, meaning island of the god Freyr. The church is situated in a pagan grave field with barrows around it. Beneath the church, a birch stump was found, around which were scattered the bones of many animals which had likely been hung from the tree. They were not all domestic animals, as many bear and elk bones were included too, and these were dated to the end of the 10th to the early 11th century. The gnawing marks on the bones prove they had been exposed to scavengers while hung up on the tree. This birch tree has been interpreted as having represented Yggdrasill, and certainly seems to have been a cosmic center of the sort Eliade describes. Its location in a grave field of barrows is significant, since it matches the description given by Adam of Bremen, and the presence of posts in the center of barrows helps us to imagine the rituals associated with their construction. We must not be tempted to view funerary rites only in the context of disposing of corpses and grieving the loss of loved ones. It is evident from the description given by Ibn Fadlan and the archaeological evidence from this video that funeral rites and burial places were central to the religious rites and spirituality of the pagan Norse. They were surrounded by death. From barrows to sacrificial poles and trees, they worshipped the dead and considered death in battle a great honor. It was a culture that was ever conscious of death in a way that most modern people could scarcely imagine. Grave fields can be found all across Sweden, and some of them were in constant use from the Bronze Age to the Viking Age. But the grave fields often contain other monuments which correspond to associated rites. One such monument is the stone ship, the most famous of which is next to Enens Hög, the largest barrow in Sweden. The barrow is dated to the migration era and later became a ting site where people would meet for public assemblies, which may have made use of the stone ship settings. However, it is hard to date the ships themselves, since the tradition of building stone ships began in the Nordic Bronze Age and continued for over 2,000 years into the Viking era. They are certainly associated with burials and often contain a grave or cremation burial. This one is located in a grave field of some 250 burials dating to the Iron Age, called Åsa Gravefield. The stone ship is known today as the Åsa Domareseter, which means the divine judge's seat, indicating it may have been associated not just with burial rituals, but also with legal matters, again relating to the ting. The island of Gotland has many stone ships, perhaps the most impressive of which is Treudd's grave, which is dated to the Nordic Bronze Age. It became associated in later Norse lore with the mythical progenitor of the Gotlanders, Treudd or Thjalfi, who was the servant of the god Thor in Norse mythology. It is quite reasonable to associate this tradition of stone ships with the Vendel era tradition of boat burials, such as those from the barrows at Vendel and Valsgärde. Some of the barrows at these sites contained entire ships in which the deceased was placed along with weapons, arrows, gaming pieces, sacrificial animals, and most famously ornate and beautiful helmets, which are now emblematic of ancient Sweden. Just like the stone ships, the ship burials continued in the Viking era, showing a continuity of belief and practice of this tradition, which clearly indicates the dead require transport to aid their passage to the next world. This tradition is also evident in earlier Indo-European burials, in which men are buried with horse sacrifices and with wheeled vehicles. Another interesting monument among the barrows of Åsa Gravefield is this peculiar three-pronged stone setting. Known in Sweden as a Treudd, they are often found in central Sweden and southwest Norway in Iron Age gravefields from about 200 to 1050 AD. 65% of them contain burials, but the rest do not. There is usually just one per gravefield, as at Åsa, so it seems there were cultic monuments for ritual areas, especially when you consider that many of them contained a post or upraised pole or stone at the centre, and some were even built around a living tree in the centre. The Swedish archaeologist Anders Andrén has suggested that the three prongs represent the three roots of the world tree, the cosmic centre of the universe for these people who performed sacrifices within. Archaeological findings from the Bronze Age and Iron Age show that sacrifices were also deposited at the base of rocks and boulders, and Andreas Nordberg argues that these rocks and boulders should be regarded as having the same function of the sacrificial trees and poles. It is not uncommon to find large standing stones in gravefields in Sweden, but sometimes these are in a line at the top of a ridge, like here, and they seem to have marked some kind of land boundary in this case. The Vikings like to live in proximity to the ancient sacred places of the Nordic Bronze Age. This means they sometimes built their halls near Bronze Age barrows, and they built their barrows near Bronze Age rock carvings. Släbro in Södermanland is a fascinating example of such continuity in the landscape. Around the river Nyköpingsån are barrows, runestones, and the most unusual Bronze Age rock carvings in Sweden.
When it comes to petroglyphs, I've seen all kinds of stuff in Sweden, for example. I've seen Tarnum, all the great rock carvings there, and I've seen very interesting and unique carvings at Rösaring. They're not so unique because most of the time when you're looking at Bronze Age petroglyphs from Scandinavia, there's some common themes. You can see the soles of feet sort of outlined. You can see figures often doing some kind of ritual stuff, carrying weapons, that kind of thing, carrying instruments. You can see animals. You can see boats, a lot of boats. But here at Släbro, there are no boats. There are no humans and animals. There are no souls. There are very few of the solar crosses that we see elsewhere. There are a few here, but there are a great many very peculiar symbols that are found only here, and here in great numbers. Apparently, there was some kind of unique artistic expression of a regional religious cult here in the Nordic Bronze Age that was nowhere else. And these symbols are kind of like squares. dots inside them. They're consistent in their style, but each one is different. Some have a line going through the center horizontally, or sometimes it's lengthways. There are sometimes stripes in each of the compartments of the squares. Sometimes there are dots. Sometimes there's a circle instead of a square. And then there are these horns on it or something. There seems to be quite little consistency in the, in this variety of the ways that they represent this peculiar symbol. If it is one symbol, you could speculate for the rest of your life about what these mean, because there's such diversity and they're so enigmatic, so charming. What could they be? They remind me a bit of Aboriginal Australian art, but in fact there is no art in the entire world that matches what you find here at Släbro. It's an opportunity to let your imagination run riot. Let me know in the comments if you have any ideas what these symbols could mean. But it's certain that they were carved in the Nordic Bronze Age by Nordic people, because the carvings which were uncovered in the 80s were associated with nearby Bronze Age finds. And actually that's the case with all these petroglyphs in Scandinavia. They date to the Bronze Age.
Rösaring is another Bronze Age petroglyph, but which gives a much more clear picture of Bronze Age Nordic religion.
This part of the petroglyph really reinforces that this was a culture very much in sync with the steppe Indo-European culture from which it derived. Here we have a stylized horse, not unlike those seen in other Norse images from like Gotland picture stones and such, and rune stones. And those date to the Viking Age, I might add. And while this is Bronze Age, so much earlier, and shows consistency between the Bronze Age Nordic culture and the much later Viking Age cultures and Iron Age cultures. Well, there's this very heavily stylized chariot coming off the back. The reins in this spiral shape, it ends in a spiral kind of circles here, and these obviously represent the wheels being towed along by this horse. I think it's a beautiful depiction of a chariot, very Indo-European, and it brings to mind the Treudd chariot of Denmark, which is roughly contemporary. The whole area of Släbro is cut through by a river, and on either side of it there are grave fields, collections of barrows basically, most of them dating to Vendel and Viking era. Now it's a very peaceful place. We're not far from the city of Nyköping, but just on its outskirts there's this peaceful river and forest and all these barrows, which are protected now by a mess of thorns and the ticks and mosquitoes who dwell in this area and attack those who would visit the barrows.
Through the woods near to the barrows, you can find 2 rune stones standing near the riverbank, which are dated to the late Viking era and which, despite being ostensibly Christian, had been thrown into the river.
Släbro, in the Viking Age, it was known as Släbro, and this runestone tells us about the people who owned it. One of them was named Hrólfr. Hrólfr is who this stone was erected for when he died, by his wife and his 2 sons, Hormundr and Ulfr. And he owned this area along with someone else called Freystone, or Freystein, named after the god Frey. Some people dispute the meaning of the face on this stone. There are other stones which have faces like this. In fact, Viking art often has this bearded kind of face as a central motif, whether it's on brooches or shield bosses or rune stones, all kinds of things, and it carries on into the Christian era from the pagan era, and we see it as a way of depicting Jesus with that face, and also in pre-Christian times depicting what we consider may have been the gods, but it's hard to tell. For that reason, some people say that this is a depiction of Thor. But how did they come to that conclusion? There's nothing about it that specifically screams this is Thor. Other people have said it's Jesus, because right at the bottom there is a little cross, a very small one, almost like it was added as an afterthought. It almost seems like the cross wasn't part of the original rune stone design. But even if it was, that doesn't necessarily mean this is Jesus. It could be Hrólfr, for all I know. I don't think there's anything about it you can conclusively say it's Jesus or Thor. What makes this stone very interesting is that it says Hrólfr and Frøysting were thanes of strength. And this expression, thanes of strength, is used in a few other runestones. A thane is just a warrior who is part of the retinue of a leader, and that structure of Germanic structure of thanes around their leader, warriors around the leader, goes right back to the early Germanic stages where Tacitus, the Roman historian, is describing the comitatus. So the same thing, the same structure existed in Norse society, and I guess when they started to have more contact with Anglo-Saxons, they just liked the word thane and brought it back with them and started to describe themselves as thanes of strength, which seems to have been a specific description or perhaps of magical significance or some kind of poetic significance. So, Hrólfr, thane of strength, will always be remembered as long as this stone stands.
55 miles northeast of Släbro is an ancient sacred processional path which starts at the site of a Viking era house and heads south for 540 meters to a Bronze Age burial ground. The road was made comparatively recently in the 9th century. You can still see some of the original marker stones. It felt like a very holy place as I trod that ancient path. The left-hand side of the path has post holes all along it, which most likely once had god poles in them that would be venerated by the procession. There are several large barrows and cairns at the end of the path, the oldest dating to the Bronze Age and the most recent to the Viking Age, when the site was revived as a ritual centre. The barrows were well placed to be visible from passing ships on Lake Mälar below. Next to the barrows is a Treudd town or labyrinth called Rösaring. This mysterious pattern is found across Europe and Asia in many cultures, and I already tried to explain its origins in a dedicated video on Treudd towns. This one, like all Treudd towns, is hard to date, but is first mentioned in local sources in 1670. It's a labyrinth path made from rocks and was most likely used in the Viking Age as part of the sacred procession. After walking the path, the initiate had to walk the labyrinth to the world of the dead. Its proximity to the barrows, which were certainly seen as portals to the underworld, clearly indicates a connection. There is a similar but more well preserved Treudd town near the Ern and Trög barrows I mentioned earlier, where you can still make out the distinctive shape which you may recognise from British rock art. On bus route 666 north of Stockholm, there is an old church, behind which lie some enormous barrows, and these barrows remain important for a famous Swede to this day.
Behind us we have an entire grave field of burial mounds from the Iron Age, just sort of migration era of the Germanic peoples. They're pretty impressive. Marcus Folin is here with me and he can tell us a little bit about it. Hi Marcus.
Hello, good to be on the channel. Yeah, basically we have 3 grave mounds, never been excavated, so there might be a treasure buried. As we saw when we inspected it, saw the shots before, there might have been some potential grave robbers as well. Don't really know, maybe some poor farmer back in the day.
so little to say about an unexcavated mound, but it's such a prominent mound in the landscape. It's obviously been important for everyone living around it for so long. It's very close to a church, and I doubt that's a coincidence. I'm sure they wanted to sacralize the area or take it away from its pagan associations. Obviously, even during the Viking era, this burial mound and all the surrounding mounds in this gravefield were hundreds of years old. And they remained important even after the Norse stopped burying people here. They undoubtedly still used this gravefield in a religious context. And people still use it today. They come here to look at it and enjoy the serene, scenic views. And you yourself like to come here sometimes, do you not?
Yeah, definitely, I do. I've been coming here quite a bit. So, again, we're out not only inland, but quite far out in the countryside. Very peaceful, tranquility, meditative place to be. So yeah, I come here every once in a while. For everyone who's subscribed to my channel, you probably recognize the place. I've filmed quite a lot here over the years. So yeah, nice place for a picnic, especially on a glorious day such as this.
Swedish Christians have always been conscious of their Viking origins, so that one often finds rune stones in churchyards, or even built into the foundations of churches. In the graveyard around Strängnäs Cathedral, which was built on a pagan holy site, you can see not only rune stones, but even barrows, which were built for local nobles and clergy in the 18th century. That even a priest could be buried in a barrow in modern times shows how important these monuments have always been for the Swedish people. I hope they remain so forever. A big thank you to the 3 artists who contributed wonderful art for this video. You can also access exclusive private videos which I make just for patrons if you sign up for either Patreon or Subscribestar for as little as the price of a pint per month. The links for these are in the description. If you support me, you will be ensuring this channel continues to survive and celebrate ancient European history for years to come. So thank you so much.